our vision at NCX is a world where landowners own land that's fully and fairly valued for all of these nature positive benefits that it's providing that like we're just not measuring and paying for right now. And everybody in society wants more or less of these things, right? We want less carbon in the atmosphere. We want more wildlife. We want healthier soil. We just don't really have great mechanisms to pay for that. And so that's part of what we're hoping to really build into and make accessible for landowners.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Now, today, we are talking about the little guys. You know, we normally talk about publicly owned forests, huge swaths of land that are managed for multiple values, public values, and all that kind of stuff, and we're trying to figure out how can we manage those areas for the ultimate in sustainability right now. And how do we continue to do that? Sustainable values all around, all the values, right? Not just timber values, but everything we can think of. That's the ultimate in sustainability. Now, we talk about that a lot. So I wanted to, there's this other chunk of land, this other area. It's a lot smaller, but there's a lot more people involved with it. And that is privately owned forests. So private landholders. How do we help them do the ultimate and sustainable management? And the honest to God truth is, a lot of them depend on their land for their income to put bread on the table, that kind of thing. And so even if they want to do sustainable thing, provide habitat, carbon capture, and clean water, and manage for all kinds of different values, it's really hard for them to justify it because they have to feed themselves, So how do we do that? How do we make it possible for them to be able to do the ultimate in sustainability? And the answer is simple. We pay them. Now, who pays them? That is the question. How do we get that to work? Right? It's a weird one. So fortunately, there is a company called NCX, Natural Capital Exchange, and their co-founder, Max Nova, came on to talk about all the different stuff that is out there, ways for private landowners to make money doing the right thing. And I love this idea because all of a sudden we go from private landowners having to, deforest their land and turn it into agriculture or something like that, or, something unsustainable. To now they can be incentivized to use their land to capture carbon or to provide habitat or maybe a fire smart break or whatever. I don't know what it might be. But the point is that it opens up the door for them to make different decisions than they have in the past. And I love that. So Max came in to give us that option to talk about all the options that are out there. And I'm really excited about this one because it's something I haven't talked about, private lands, and this is a good idea because the more people we can get on board, the more we get to talking about natural solutions for all kinds of different reasons. So I'm all in. Let's do this. Sponsors for this episode, Wes Fraser is the number one. Been with me since the beginning. And yeah, I couldn't do this without them. Thank you, Wes Fraser, for your unwavering support. It has been so fantastic. And Greenlink Forestry is also a sponsor. They have also been with me since the beginning. Can't thank them enough. Wouldn't be possible without them. So, all right, let's dive into this conversation about private lands and how they can be sustainable with Max Nova. Here we go. Yeah, thanks a lot, Max, for taking the time to do this. I appreciate it. This is a conversation I haven't really had yet, so I'm looking forward to diving into it. So, first of all, I think on my podcast, we talk a lot about sustainable forest management on the large scale, right? On the national scale or provincial scale, state scale, whatever it might be, just kind of the broad trends and how they're moving and shifting and shaking things up, right? I've never, or very seldom, have I dived down to the smaller scale level, right? To try and break down, okay, how exactly can individual landowners contribute to these concepts and ideas? So I figured, yeah, this was an excellent opportunity to get into that, right? How can people contribute to sustainability on a broader scale with their own land, right? So with that, first, I just want to know why you started doing this, and more importantly, why you continue to put time and effort and dedication into, this business, this idea.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I mean, this is a great podcast, and we're excited to help landowners understand what their options are out there in the world. And this is year 14 for me here at NCX.
Nice.
So my name is Max Nova. I'm one of the founders, and I'm the COO of NCX. And we've actually been on a very long journey over the years to get to where we are now, helping landowners try to understand all these programs that are available for them. We actually started off 14 years ago when I was an undergrad. I met a guy at the School of Forestry, and he had invented this technology to measure trees from space. And so we spent the first 10 years of the company actually just working with big institutional timberland owners, trying to help them understand their forest. But the idea was always that forests are valuable for more than just what you can cut down and roll out of the forest, right? How do we start to measure and pay for all of these other values that we all know forests provide, but just as a civilization, we do a really miserable job of measuring and paying for. And so that's always been the core mission of the company. And at least in the United States, it turns out that small landowners own a huge amount of acreage, actually much more than the big institutional landowners. There's a fair bit of government ownership as well, but private landowners are really where a lot of the climate economy and land management happen. And so that's who we serve.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense, right? There's a big hole there in where the knowledge is getting spread out to. So why not serve those people, right? That makes sense. Totally. So why you personally, why did you get into this? What's the driver for you? What's the inspiration, I should say?
Yeah. So I grew up in Kentucky. I spent, a lot of time outdoors growing up, but I went off to college. Actually, I thought I was going to be pre-med. But my freshman summer, I was rescued from that fate by Zach, who's my co-founder. He was the guy at the School of Forestry. And I started hanging around the School of Forestry just because I love understanding how the world works. Like that's really actually been the core driver for me. I mean, everything in the world is either grown or mined. And a lot of that happens in forests, that comes from the land, like the entire material basis of our civilization. And it's just such a core part of all of our everyday lives. And we, most people don't think about it at all. And those are the sort of things that are fascinating to me. And forestry is connected to everything in the world, from the houses that we live in, to the food we eat, to the water that we drink. It all ultimately ties back to forests in a lot of ways. And especially now with all this climate stuff happening, like forests are front and center in a lot of that. But it's also a place where there's usually very poor data. Forests are big, they're messy, they're often out in the middle of nowhere, right?
Yeah,
it's sort of hard to wrap your head around it and to figure out like, well, what can I even do with this? Like, how can I create more of these values? And then like ultimately it's got to pencil out for landowners too. Like what actually makes sense for me and my land? It's actually really non-trivial to figure that stuff out. And that's a lot of what we try to help with here at NCX.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's super tangible, right? Like it's all well and good to talk about how we want sustainable values forever, but the dollars and cents of it is if people can't sustain a living off of it, then they can't justify it and it's not going to happen. So It has to be something that's made profitable in some way, or at least some kind of investment where people can see the dividends coming around the corner, right? So I'm excited to dive into this concept because I don't really understand it all that well. So I guess we should talk about, NCX, you talked about it a little bit, where it started. Where is it now? So maybe you just want to do a little bit of quick flyby of what NCX is and the main thing, what you guys do.
Sure. So if you're a landowner right now, there's a lot of public and private programs that you might be able to participate in that'll either do some cost share for you to help you cover the cost of planting trees, or maybe you could get paid for carbon credits, or maybe there's government programs that you want to be in for protecting wildlife habitat. But there's an enormous amount of these, and they're starting to become more and more private programs that are available as these private companies start to try to do some of these carbon credits and things like that. But it's a mess if you're a landowner to try to figure out, what are you eligible for? How much could I make? What are the trade-offs between these programs? So NCX stands for the Natural Capital Exchange. And the whole idea is, landowners, you're sitting on an asset that actually could be much more valuable than you think right now. Your land is valuable for more than just the timber you're taking off of it. It's valuable for more than just, the row crops you're planting or the cattle you're grazing. But how can you access these markets for these new nature positive assets? How can you develop new revenue streams for your property? It's still very early for a lot of those markets right now, and it's tricky for landowners to navigate. And so what NCX does is we just have a big directory of all these programs. We have some technology in the back end where we'll evaluate people's property and help them understand, well, what acres are eligible for what programs, what's my ROI on these things, and just try to boil it down to the dollars and cents so that landowners can make decisions and find the right programs for them and their land.
Gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, I'm in the forestry world, and every once in a while I'll dive into the concept of like carbon markets and other stuff like that. And to try and stick handle what's going on there, it's challenging, right? So yeah, no, that seems like a super useful organization to have to just help steer people in the right direction, right? Of where they can make the most impact and most bang for their buck, right? So
yeah,
very cool.
Well, and I'll tell you, it's a full-time job to like read through all these contracts and try to figure out what are the payouts, what are the liabilities, what are the restrictions, and all that. And so we do a lot of that so that the landowners don't have to, and you just go to the website, and we have like sort of broken out in plain English, all these major factors for the programs. And it's still pretty early, and it's been a fascinating experience for us too, just to see where are the transactions happening, which of these programs are actually working for landowners, and which of them does the risk reward really not pencil out for most landowners yet.
Sure. Yeah, like you said, it's early on in these type of marketplaces, so it's probably figuring out exactly where things fall apart is just kind of happening right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and everybody's land is different too, right? Sure. Like every acre is unique out there, in terms of like what programs you're eligible for, what the actual the productivity of the land is, and that's going to affect how much payment you can get for these things. And like your productivity for timber might be garbage, but maybe, for some other use, like for wildlife habitat, maybe it's an amazing parcel of land. And so identifying those opportunities is part of what we help landowners think through too.
Gotcha. Okay. So yeah, you said a statement, and it's on your website and all that too, the nature positive thing, right? That's a big thing for NCX, showing that we want to promote nature positive solutions, nature positive economy, all that kind of stuff. So can you define that for me? What do you mean by nature positive?
Sure.
And then after that, I want to get into how you decide that a program is that.
Yep. Yeah. So we have a pretty broad tent right now. And I think as natural resource professionals, there's always trade-offs with everything, right? Something that might be, even like between individual wildlife species, right? Like, a dense forest might be great for some species, but then, some bird species might need a much thinner forest, and there's always trade-offs between these things. And so we don't want to be shy about that. Like our job is to be as transparent with landowners about like what actually are the trade-offs between these programs, and so we don't do stuff that's just like straight up purely non-sustainable extractive stuff. Like we don't have any mining leases. We don't have any like natural gas stuff, that type of stuff isn't on NCX. But like, for example, we do have timber harvesting on NCX, right? Like we think that's part of sustainable management of forest. It's certainly a really important part of the natural economy. In fact, like timber is one of the only nature values that a lot of landowners get paid for right now. And so
for sure.
It's also useful too for landowners to compare some of these new opportunities to something that they already understand, like timber, and carbon is a good example of that, right? It's actually like, when you understand your timber economics, you can look at, well, what price would I have to get paid per ton of carbon for this to pencil out? And then a landowner can have an actual quantitative framework to think about these new markets in a way that like isn't totally untethered from reality. And you can actually compare it to something that you already know.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, it seems like it seems like, yeah, like in the past, there was really only a couple ways to make money off your land. There was harvest the timber, turn it into some kind of, pasture or agricultural land. So deforestation essentially, right? And but you're also contributing to the food source and all that. But it's, from a sustainable standpoint, it's deforestation, right? Or the other option was you could turn it into could harvest the timber and turn it into a permanent plantation where which is also has its value in one way or another, but it's not necessarily, that's tied into human uses of wood and not necessarily tied into the nature positive, promoting other type of stuff. So perhaps in the carbon footprint perspective, it might be, but so those are really the only two revenues now, or revenue streams that like in the past. And now it sounds like, from what you're telling me, that there's other options out there now. Like you might be able to get paid for maintaining water quality or providing more water quality or providing opportunities for biodiversity or habitat and that kind of stuff. So, that's got to be huge for people that, want to be landowners and they want to continue to make money off it, but they also want to contribute to the sustainable solutions in, today's world of climate change and everything else.
Absolutely. Like when we talk to landowners, actually, financial return is important to the extent that it helps landowners stay on the land. Yeah. Right. Like you can't be running at a loss. But most landowners, most landowners are not, the land isn't necessarily their like number one most productive financial investment, right? Like they're owning the land for other reasons, right? Because they love being out in nature, because they want to leave a legacy for their kids, because they just like walking in the woods and seeing the wildlife for hunting. Hunting leases are actually another like what I would consider a sort of more traditional way of monetizing the forest. You can lease out the hunting rights or other recreational rights. Sure. They're starting to be like, Airbnbs for staying in a cabin in the cottonwood, and actually like on a per acre basis, you can do pretty good on some of those revenue streams.
Okay. Nice.
But, the carbon programs are coming up, for some of these very nascent markets like water, like some of the wildlife habitat stuff. Sometimes there's corporate sponsors for things like that in particular localized geographies, and we kind of help try to connect the dots there. But a lot of those are government programs, and often those are not structured as really profit-making things for landowners, but you can get a cost share for those. So, if you want to have more bird habitat on your property, you can often find a government program that will cover, if not all of the cost, at least a pretty good percentage of that cost. And so that's there's cost shares, and then there's true, like, you can make new revenue streams off your land. And so there's a mix of these things, but we help landowners sort of differentiate between those and figure out what's going to be the right fit. But this is constantly evolving. I mean, we see new programs come on every week. I think we're up to something like 80 or 90 programs now. And I would expect in a couple of years, like 3 years from now, I wouldn't be surprised if there's 500 programs. We're just seeing an explosion of these things, both from governments and from private companies that want to be able to say that they're having an impact in their communities in some kind of measurable way.
Yeah, no, totally. That makes sense. Yeah. It seems like there's more and more buy-in to the concept of reinvesting back into the natural world, right? Even from large corporate entities who have money to burn and throw at these issues, and it seems like it's getting more and more popular. And so I could totally imagine Bill Gates one day being like, I want to invest $10 billion in biodiversity in the United States or whatever, right? Like who knows, right? So I think there's probably huge potential there for sure. So
Bill Gates himself actually has a pretty non-trivial effect on these markets right now. I mean, he is a big buyer. He and Bill Gates, I think personally, is the biggest buyer of carbon offsets from a Swiss company called Climeworks, which does direct air capture, where they have like a machine that sucks carbon out of the sky. Crazy. Bill Gates actually is like a little bit down on nature positive solutions for carbon capture. Yeah. So it might not be Bill, but there's plenty of other.
He's a tech guy. That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. What are you going to do with these tech guys? So.
He's not all that impressed with the technology of a tree.
Yeah, exactly.
autonomous growing thing that just will pull carbon out of the air and create biomass for
but
you.
The install base is incredible on these trees. It's like billions of acres. So
yeah.
I mean, trees have to be an important part of the climate solution ultimately.
For sure. Absolutely. Yeah, no, it makes sense. So, okay. So, can you break down kind of just quickly, which of these revenue streams, like which of these options for private landowners is kind of that, that actual revenue stream, the actual like, hey, you can make money on this going forward in perpetuity for a certain amount of time. And which one of is kind of just like offsetting the cost, like, like you were saying, government programs or whatever. So can you kind of split those up into where they are right now? Obviously, this might change by the time this podcast comes out. Who knows?
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. And the forester's favorite answer is always, it depends, right? So even within these categories, right? I think of something like tree planting. Like there's definitely government programs that you can get that'll help, cover the cost of your seedlings. But then there's also like private programs that are just run by private carbon project developers that, and the terms are different for some of these programs, right? Like sometimes you get an upfront payment. Sometimes, they cover the planting cost and then you get a smaller annual payment over time.
Okay.
And so there's a bunch of different ways of structuring this. And for landowners, the thing that's really important is to make sure you understand what are the risks and what are the rewards, and what is the timing of those rewards? What do you actually have to do? And who's holding the bag if things go wrong? Because that's the other thing about the nature economy, right? Is nature never stands still. It's constantly changing, right? And you're maybe just one season away from like a big beetle infestation or a wildfire or something. And so making sure you understand the risk profile of these different programs is very important to the bottom line for landowners.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. So what are companies like specifically, like you were saying, I wanted to know earlier how someone can get paid for biodiversity or habitat and water quality, or specifically even wildfire risk, right? And you were mentioning most of those are just government programs to help you offset the cost. Is that the case? Or can you give me an example of one where there's like, say, wildfire risk? That seems like a big one where there could be huge payouts if you're, a big landowner surrounding a community or something. If you firewise your area, that I'm assuming someone probably would like to pay for that.
Yeah. I mean, the question of who pays when bad things happen in the environment. I mean, like this is the whole question of externalities, right? And the tragedy of the commons and all these kind of things. And for some categories of projects like carbon projects, actually, there's starting to be some rails on that, right? Like it's starting to be like, oh, companies need to disclose their emissions. The companies are going to be responsible for offsetting that. For things like wildfire, it's still very early, and it's like, totally. The insurance companies are pointing at the state and the state's pointing at the landowners and the landowners pointing at the insurance companies. And then the homeowners and the wildland urban interface are like, what do we do? Our houses are burning down, and it's a mess right now. Sure. And in those cases, I expect probably what we will see is government and NGO programs to begin probably to pilot out some mechanisms for payment for some of these ecosystem services like wildfire risk reduction. And then, as these markets become more mature, maybe see things like, it would be amazing if the insurance companies would change your insurance premiums if you can prove that you are doing more, fire-wise forest management. We're not there yet.
Yeah.
But hopefully that's part of the change that we can help drive, right? As we help educate landowners about these programs, as we make these programs more accessible to landowners and make it easier for governments and corporations that want these outcomes on the landscape. Like we want California that doesn't catch on fire like all the time and create billions of dollars of damage, right? But how do we deploy dollars to the acres to create that change? That's a big challenge right now. So, but if we help more landowners access these markets, those mechanisms become a lot more viable.
Okay. But there is something available. There's the odd thing here and there for that kind of stuff. Just nothing major yet.
Yeah, for not for wildfire. But that's something that we certainly keep a close eye on, and really a lot of our job too is keep our head on a swivel, see these new programs that are coming out and sort of digest them, and read all the contracts and the fine print to boil it down. So it just becomes a dollars and cents calculation for landowners.
Awesome. That's very cool. Cool. So, okay. So what are investors looking for? What are the hot topic values that companies are wanting to support at this point?
Well, the big story over the last couple of years has been all these net zero commitments from these corporations that say, we emit carbon, but it's okay. We're gonna reduce the amount of carbon we emit, and then anything that we can't reduce, we're gonna buy carbon offsets, and we'll pick a date in the future. Maybe it's 2030, maybe it's 2040, maybe it's 2050. Different companies choose different ones. And so a lot of companies made those claims in like the 2020s, and that actually spurred a lot of activity in forest carbon markets in particular. Just, like you were saying, there's a lot of trees out there. It's a pretty obvious source for carbon credits. But in the last, I'd say 18 months, there's been a lot of controversy about forest carbon credits in particular that get into, some technical things that I'd be happy to talk around like baselines and like, were these credits like, did we create real change here or what? But it's actually causing a big problem for a lot of these corporations right now. And you'll notice actually a lot fewer announcements lately around these net zero goals, and people are being a lot quieter about it because they're a little scared actually right now of using forest carbon credits. And if you can't use forest carbon credits, it's kind of unclear where the sheer volume of carbon credits to make good on these 2030 claims is going to come from. Right. And so a lot of people, I think, are now doing the math, and they're like, ooh, did we say 2030? We meant 2040, which of course, I mean, that's a tragedy for the climate. It's not good for landowners, right? Like, you want to have robust demand for forest carbon credits for landowners. That means the prices will be better.
Yeah.
But it's a market that still is really working itself out. Yeah. And forest carbon is much farther along than something like water or wildfire.
Yeah. I guess the carbon thing is, the climate change is on everyone's mind, and sucking up that carbon is top of the list for most people. They know it's a big hit for investors and everybody else. So it makes sense. So,
but I will say, like, a bright spot for investors and stuff is solar. I spend a lot of time driving around talking with landowners, and in rural America, I see solar farms going up all the time. Now there's plenty of baggage with solar too. And a lot of rural communities are like, why are we converting prime agricultural land into solar panels? But it's the prices that these solar developers are paying, and it's enabled by a lot of the Inflation Reduction Act incentives and things like that. Landowners are looking at this. They're like, I'm about to become a solar millionaire if I sign this solar lease, right? And the county commissioners are looking at it, and they're like, wow, this is a stable tax base for the next 30 years. Like,
oh, wow,
this makes a lot of sense for, a county that otherwise sees a lot of the economic indicators moving in the wrong direction. But it certainly changes the character of a lot of these rural areas too. And so it's a very active topic of conversation, but the amount of money flowing into solar in particular is unbelievable.
Really?
And so like that's an option that we have for landowners on the site, and on a dollar per acre basis, like the solar stuff is way higher than any other use of the land, other than like, turning it into like subdivisions.
Right.
But a lot of landowners just, it's one of the first questions we ask landowners is we say, hey, would you ever consider putting a solar farm in? And a lot of people are like, absolutely not. And it's like, okay, great. Like, let's talk about all the other opportunities.
Gotcha. So that's probably the most profitable one then. That's interesting that it's that viable, because I feel like there's still, like, you're starting to see people putting them up on their homes and stuff like that, and you're seeing more and more of them. But I feel like the talk online and that kind of stuff, there's still a lot of wishy-washiness, a lot of unknowns for people, right? They're not sure if it's the right time to invest. But it's interesting to hear that with the right incentives, it sounds like it's absolutely the right time to invest in that.
Yeah, well, it's driven by a lot of the government incentives. And just to be clear, a lot of these programs are structured as like community solar, where it's like less for the landowner's own use, and it's more like for the, it's like a utility project for the other landowners in the county. And so, for solar panels, it's like that's for your own personal use, like if you're putting them on your home. Yeah. Right. But like we're talking about like hundreds of acres to thousands of acres installation of utility size solar, and that's just a different ballgame.
Big time. Yeah. So what do you think is the aversion to it? When you tell landowners about it and you ask, hey, would you ever consider putting a big solar project to support your community on your land? And they say no. Why do you think they're saying no?
Yeah. There's a very like easy aesthetic answer, right? Like I can tell you personally, like given the choice between looking at a solar farm and looking at a beautiful forest, I'll choose the forest every time. Now, like if you paid me $10 million to do the solar farm, maybe I'd think a little harder about that, right? Which is the position that a lot of landowners are in. But it's also tricky because you have like, if you and I are neighbors and you take the $10 million check to become, a solar farm, and I don't see any of that money, and I got to look at your solar farm next door. It's like you can see why that starts to become an issue in some of these places, but also it is a land use change, right? Going from agricultural land to something that's like power utility generation. And in a lot of these communities, agriculture has been the lifeblood of the community for, decades. And so it is a change in the character of the county. And that matters. It's like these are places where people tend to have grown up there. The land is really important to them. The community is really important to them. And when that changes, that's not always a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I could see, and that's interesting that's what I was thinking, that it was more of a, I want more forest. I want more habitat. I want more deer. I want more of that, that aesthetically pleasing recreational, maybe carbon capture stuff, versus putting a solar farm in has the same, it's not really, it's nature positive in a different way, right? It's nature positive in that we're reducing our reliance on fossil fuels and therefore reducing our carbon footprint indirectly that way. But it's not providing the additionality of biodiversity and that kind of thing. But it's still nature positive. It's just a different way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
so I was thinking more of that.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs. In fact, some of the weirdest, most surreal moments I've had in my career are when somebody calls me up and they say, hey, could you do some analysis of the biomass in this forest? Because I'm trying to figure out, like, if I cut all this down and I put in a solar farm, is that like carbon positive? Is that like a good carbon move or a bad carbon move?
What's the carbon math?
Yeah. No, but I mean, like, ultimately it does come down to math, right? And that's one of the things that I love about the work that we do at NCX is like really breaking this down to the real numbers so that people can understand the actual trade-offs that they're making. Because the few things are like truly a free lunch out there. And it's all about balancing balancing these trade-offs in the context of your unique land and the values and like your objectives, right? Like if you're trying to maximize for revenue, then maybe you do solar. But if you're trying to maximize for your personal and your family's recreation out in the woods and some hunting and stuff, it's like, well, maybe that's not the right answer.
Totally. Yeah. The values that each landowner has, right, is going to drastically change what's valuable to them, right? Like how they want to, that's funny how that shifts from person to person, right? Like it's not like society has the same values. Like every person has their own individual values that they value more than something else. So it's absolutely, it's quite the landscape to try to navigate. That's cool.
Yep. So although one of the things that is cool is to be able to use the same acre for multiple land use types. So actually like there's a bunch of news stories now coming up about what they call agrivoltaics, which is like where you have a solar farm, but you also like are grazing sheep on it.
Oh,
too,
I see.
Right, where you're using the same acre for multiple purposes. But there's lots of programs like that. You could do a forest carbon program and still do hunting leases on those same acres, right? And so we call this stackability, where you can stack multiple values on the same acre and potentially get multiple revenue streams from an individual acre. But like, again, trying to figure out like what programs are compatible, like which of your acres can you stack what on, it's kind of a mess. And so we do a bunch of like data crunching on the back end to try to simplify that process. Because ultimately for a landowner, if you can make more revenue per acre, that's usually a good thing.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I'm just imagining come tax season, if you're on your own and you're trying to stack all these incentives for all these companies, and you're like, okay, how do my tax? Like, I imagine even most accountants are looking at it, getting a headache, going, how the hell do I sort out what they're allowed to do, right? So I can only imagine. Yeah, it's hugely complicated, and just the people want to do it, but they don't want to get caught doing something they're not supposed to do that they didn't realize, right?
Yeah,
and
exactly.
That's crazy. So that's interesting. I didn't realize that solar would be so profitable, but it's good to hear, right? It's nice to know that that's a feasible option for people. So you were talking earlier about the ins and outs of the carbon market, and that's definitely something I want to get into a little more, right? So the concept of a carbon credit, what that is, how someone goes about getting it, and
Sure.
and then what are the limitations on that, right? Because I think there's been a lot of discussion. I'm kind of jumping ahead, but there's a lot of discussion about. My understanding is a lot of the problems with the confusion around carbon credits in forests is that you don't want to pay people for doing something they would have been doing anyways.
Exactly.
Right? So you need to prove that you weren't going to harvest this now anyways, so that you don't get it. But if you prove that, hey, we were about to harvest this, we're going to postpone it for 10 years, we want to capture that carbon credit. So anyways, that's my understanding anyways, but I want to dive into this. So, okay, carbon credits. How does this work in these days?
Sure. So that is a topic that I know way more than I ever wanted to know about, because we actually were a forest carbon project developer for a couple of years, and we had our own program that we had to shut down actually because we couldn't get the demand side of the market, these corporate buyers, to agree with the way we were doing it. And instead, now we're helping landowners look at all sorts of programs, right, beyond just the one NCX program that we had before. But the story for carbon credits at the highest level is actually pretty simple, right? These corporations have emitted carbon into the atmosphere, and they're like, oh, my bad. I'd like to zero that out. So I heard trees have some carbon in them. So how about I pay the people with trees, right? At a high level, that story makes a lot of sense.
Sure.
Now, what you're talking about starts to get into questions of additionality and baselines and stuff. And so I always start when I talk about carbon credits saying that there's only really two numbers that matter when you talk about carbon credits. There is the stock of carbon that you have in your tree. So that's if you cut a tree down right now and you weighed the amount of carbon in that tree, that's your stock of carbon. Okay. And then there's the baseline. And the baseline is trying to get at this question of what would your forest look like if you weren't getting paid for carbon? Because like you said, there's no point if I'm a company like Microsoft and I'm like, hey, I'm trying to zero out my carbon. Can I pay you not to cut down these trees? And you're like, yeah, I was never going to cut down those trees anyway. It's well, you just had zero impact.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And that though is a tricky thing, because I know how to measure the stock of carbon in a tree, right? In the crudest possible example, right? You cut down the tree and you put it on a scale and you weigh it, and there you go.
Sure.
Problem solved. Now, there's more sophisticated ways to do that, right? But that's the thing that
for today's conversation, that'll do. Yeah.
Yeah. But the baseline actually is much, much trickier. This question of when I look into your eyes, and we're sitting here playing carbon poker. Are you actually going to cut down that tree or not? Now, you're a forester. I come from a forestry background. You can do, timber economics is a thing that we can understand a lot about, right? And we can do harvest scheduling and all this type of stuff, but it depends, right? It depends on what's the growth rate of these trees on the particular site they're on. What do we think timber prices are doing? What do we think the risks are in this area? But all of these things fluctuate. Do we have good seasons? Do we have bad seasons for growth? All of these things matter, and they impact your harvest likelihood. And one of the challenges is modeling that is so complicated, and it's pretty easy for people to game that baseline. And so what a lot of early projects were is people taking land that they knew that they were never going to harvest, but based on how the baseline was being calculated, the baseline looked very different. And that was basically free money,
right,
for those guys. And it didn't create a lot of climate impact. And that's what you've seen all these Bloomberg stories and everything coming out about, it's not a question of hey, is there carbon in those trees? Everybody's yeah, there's carbon in those trees. It's really a question of was that baseline set correctly? Because the carbon credit is the difference between the stock and the baseline.
Yes. Okay.
Stock is pretty easy to understand, but it's the baseline where all these challenges come in. And the challenging part too is that a lot of these carbon contracts are for many decades. There's like a 20-year contract. I've seen a 40-year, a 60-year contract. I've seen a 120-year contract out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, can you and I sit here really and be like, yeah, we can do harvest yield forecasting a century out into the future? Like, that's horse madness. Like, nobody can do that. But that's the basis of the whole market right now. And it's a risk. It's a risk because you're just one Bloomberg story, one New York Times, one Wall Street Journal expose away from the buyers being like, ooh, I don't know if I want to buy these carbon credits. Like, are these good?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so there's a big risk potentially attached to a lot of these carbon credits right now. And so when we talk to landowners about carbon projects, there's a couple ways you can get paid, right? Like if you get all the money up front in cash, actually you're kind of ambivalent, right? Like maybe you just ethically want to make sure that you're selling a good product, right? But like from a pure dollars and cents perspective, you're like, hey, I actually don't have a lot of risk on this contract. But if somebody's telling you like, oh, hey, landowner, you should sign up for this carbon project, and in payment, you're going to get a revenue share from the sales of the carbon credits, for example. That's one where we say like, well, hey, landowner, like, do you really understand what's going on with this like underlying commodity, like with this carbon credit market? Do you really understand the risks and the benefits associated with things? And, and for some landowners, they do. And they're like, you know what? I see upside potential here. I understand the risks. I'm going to do it. And it makes sense for some landowners. Other landowners look at it and they're like, I don't know, like this looks like way riskier than anything else I got in my portfolio. So maybe I'm a pass.
Right. So for a lot of those, because I know I've had conversations in the past with folks who have broken down the forest carbon situation on like on a natural forest stand, primary forest, right? So, and they've said that, okay, so purely from a carbon perspective, if you harvest, and this is not talking about like coastal trees, this is talking about inland, normal trees.
Are we talking about normal Canadian trees or normal American trees?
This is in America. This is American. Okay. This is American. Yeah. And I forget her name now, but anyways, but they were saying that if you're harvesting like an inland tree, inland forest, it takes about 30 years for that carbon to start accumulating past what it would have accumulated in that time if you let it stand, if you assumed it didn't burn, right? So they're saying, and then after that, you start to actually add carbon, or start pulling more carbon out of the landscape than would have been there previously. So it takes 30 years for a stand at age 0 to catch up to where the old stand would have been. Then everything past that. So if it lives another 10 years, that's 10 years of extra carbon that you're sequestering. Or if it lives 80 years, that's 50 years of extra carbon it's sequestering. And that on a landowner scale, you know what I mean? Like I couldn't imagine trying to convince somebody like, okay, so you have to have a minimum of 30 years before you start actually earning something. That's got to be challenging to swallow.
Yeah, well, different programs are structured different ways, and ultimately what you're talking about is a baseline question, right? Like at what point are you producing carbon above the baseline?
It is, yes.
And so much of the debate in forest carbon markets right now is around what is a good baseline. And a lot of landowners might be surprised to learn like there is not a consensus answer to that question right now. Yeah. And it's a challenge because that means like if you're a buyer on the other end of this market, right? If I'm, Coca-Cola and I'm sitting here being like, oh, we said we would be carbon neutral. Is this a safe way for me to do that? Or like, am I going to wake up in a month and there's going to be some Guardian article about how I'm a bad person because I bought, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was working with landowners. To do the right thing. I thought it was trees. How can you be anti-tree? But there's actually been a lot of anti-forest carbon coverage. And not from people that hate trees or anything, but people that are very serious about the climate impact of these things. And they're like, well, there was a lot of money that got paid. Where is the actual climate impact here?
Yes.
But actually, this is part of why you see a big shift away from corporate buys of forest carbon credits from mature forests and to these tree planting projects.
Gotcha.
Partially because people look at the baselines there and they're like, well, this is like some barren area where there were no trees. And I kind of feel like without me paying money to plant trees, there weren't going to be a bunch of trees here.
Right.
And so like I feel better about that now. Like you and I know, like, natural regeneration, all sorts of stuff, right? So like even like tree planting stuff isn't quite as like non-controversial on the baseline front, but it certainly feels much safer to a lot of the corporate buyers than the mature stuff, which is why you see a lot of press around tree planting, because it's an easy, simple story to understand. There is less risk on the baseline in some ways. And so that there's a lot of programs out there for landowners for tree planting.
Okay. So how does the tree planting one work? So that's separate from the carbon situation?
No, the tree planting ones often are for carbon projects, but there are two distinct versions of a carbon project. One version is there's no trees here, so plant trees and the trees will grow and they will have carbon in them. So let's call that a carbon credit. The other version is
afforestation, like straight up just like adding forest where there was no forest before. There was never going to be a forest because it was agricultural land or something, and we're going to add a forest. Okay.
Yep.
That
and then
logical.
the other type of project is, hey, here's a mature forest. It's a big, beautiful forest, and like maybe I was going to cut it down, so pay me not to cut it down. And that's the improved forest management is what they call those types of projects, or you might see the acronym IFM.
Okay.
And those are the ones that have a lot more baggage, because like the big question in those scenarios was like, well, but were you really going to cut that tree down or not?
It's all trust. Yeah.
And there's not a lot of trust on the buy side of the market right now. For these projects. There's been a lot of confidence lost in the last 2 years because of some very questionable projects.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if I look at the history of capitalism, not entirely a entirely trustworthy system, so I don't blame them.
Well, and it's like there's booms and busts in all sorts of these things, and a lot of this is hopefully some just growth pains in the very early days of a new industry. Certainly our vision at NCX is a world where landowners own land that's fully and fairly valued for all of these nature positive benefits that it's providing, that like we're just not measuring and paying for right now. And everybody in society wants more or less of these things, right? We want less carbon in the atmosphere. We want more wildlife. We want healthier soil. We just don't really have great mechanisms to pay for that. And so that's part of what we're hoping to really build into and make accessible for landowners.
Yeah, it'd be a real shame, right? To leave that untapped just because we're like, well, it's too confusing. There's too, you know what I mean? Like,
exactly.
It'd be a real shame to not incentivize forest landowners or even, federal landowners to not harvest something, because we just didn't want to put in the effort to sit down, and sort it out.
But there's two components of this, right? Like one is it's confusing, and then the other is like, does this actually pencil out?
Sure.
And so
is this
what we think a lot about at NCX is like, can we help make this less confusing? But even if we made it less confusing, not every program is going to pencil out for every landowner every time.
Of course.
Right? And when I talk to landowners, I sometimes say like, listen, it wouldn't be surprising if when we look through all the programs that your land is eligible for right now, maybe today you're not going to find anything that's a good fit for your land. And that's okay. It's still early days in all this. And a lot of the value that we provide to landowners is just constantly adding new programs, helping them understand like, how is this changing? Like, when would this tip over from not making sense to making sense for my land?
Yeah, totally. No, that makes sense. So the planting one, the afforestation carbon credit part of it, I want to talk about that a little bit more, because again, Canada's got the 2 billion tree thing, right? And that's got the same back and forth, pros versus con, bullshit versus positive thing going back and forth, right? There's not a lot of belief, and there's a lot of debate. However, there's a bunch of these programs going around. I think the States has, you guys have something similar going on, I believe. I can't remember, but
my favorite quote is, 1 trillion trees will take 1 trillion hands. So somebody hasn't done the math on global population numbers lately, but
yeah, no kidding, right? But you're like, I don't know if you've ever done the math on how many humans have ever existed in the, ever, but it's not 1 trillion. Oh man, that's wild. Yeah. And so I want to dive into, how does someone get paid for that? What is the incentive, and how does the math work out for tree planting in a previously unforested landscape?
Yeah. So there's a couple different programs, and some of them are shaped just like you have to pay the seedling cost, and then you get some annual payments later on, right? And so that's one flavor of them. Other programs will actually do the planting for you, but then you get maybe an upfront payment, but no ongoing payments. And then there's starting to actually become some interesting like stackable combinations where, maybe you would have originally had to pay for the seedling cost and the planting cost, and you would have received like some stream of annual payments. But now actually somebody else will come in and they will say, well, tell you what, if you sign a timber lease with me up front, like I will pay for your tree planting costs. But then like years from now, 30 years from now or whatever, when we harvest the timber, we'll do a 50-50 split on the timber revenue, and sometimes that makes sense for landowners and sometimes it doesn't, right? And we help people think through the math, but there's starting to become all sorts of different like financialized wrappers on these things that help. Ultimately what these things are doing is providing different risk reward balances for landowners. And so it really becomes a personal question for the landowners about what's your risk tolerance, what is your preference for money now versus preference for money later. All of these things come into play as landowners consider the different flavors of these programs, because there's starting to become a lot of different flavors.
Yeah, I imagine. Yeah. I can see. So it sounds like there is, as time goes on, there is more and more investment as time goes on. There's more interest, I should say, into these types of programs.
I would say that's true for certain sectors. Like that's definitely true for solar. That's feeling up and to the right. Whereas I would say the IFM, the improved forest management, like mature forest carbon credits, like that one feels like it's in a bit of a dip right now. Tree planting actually still feels pretty up and to the right.
Okay.
And then there's also like new stuff coming on all the time. I was just, as part of my landowner tour I did in February, I was riding around in a tractor spreading rock dust on a field that's supposed to be sequestering more carbon, right? And the farmer's getting paid some dollar per acre rate on that. And so there's these new things coming up all the time, and which one of them, like which ones are going to become mass market things that make sense for millions of landowners across hundreds of millions of acres, like that's still a little too early to tell.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. That makes sense. But I feel like there's a lot of time in our society spent on breaking down like all of these programs where people are trying to do good, right? And then they're like, hey, but you screwed it up because it's not actually doing good. It's doing this. And like, you didn't consider this. And people are getting nailed to the wall for trying to be a part of a solution. And I'm like, can we just accept that we're going to keep trying, and we're probably going to keep failing, but as long as we keep trying, we're probably moving in the right direction. And like, let's stop pointing fingers and, blaming everybody for trying to do better.
Well, and I think that is a super important ethos for the industry to get right. And it feels like the pendulum has certainly swung more towards the criticism than the like, let's learn and improve. Right? Because that's really the perspective that I think we should take. And I know, as foresters, like the forest is really complicated. We know just the tiny, we have just scratched the surface on our understanding of these complex natural systems. No one knows how this is all going to shake out over the next 100 years. So we need to approach this with humility and with the expectation that we are going to make mistakes and we are going to get things wrong in the beginning.
Yeah. For sure.
Now, I do think that if you take that posture, it becomes important to take reasonable precautions. Like, let's take small steps rather than huge steps, right? And that's actually one of my personal, issues with a lot of how carbon markets are structured right now, where it's like, let's sign up for a 100-year contract right off the bat. It's like, ooh, can we like start off with like 5 years, 10 years, like take a small bite and like see how it tastes, and then start to like lock in things longer? Because like, I'm not sure I would. If I look back 100 years and, 1924, and I'm like, do I want those guys deciding how I live today? Like, I'm not sure I like 100% am on board with that one.
Yeah.
So,
it all sounds good. It sounds like a long-term investment, but you're like, there's a lot going on. There's a lot changing. Like, we need to, it makes sense. And if you take one step forward and you realize that you actually took 2 steps back, at least it's only, a couple steps to get forward again, rather than, being stuck in a 100-year contract.
Dig yourself out of a big hole. Exactly.
Yeah, no, totally. No, that makes sense. Yeah. It feels like I don't know what it is, if it's a gotcha thing, right? People like the gotcha. They like the gotcha, right?
It.
Like, I got you. You're not actually doing this. You must actually be, some greedy corporate person or whatever, right? And you're like, or they're just somebody that tried something, didn't have the time to dig into the deep, dirty details about this project, and now they need to rethink it. Like, it could just be that.
Yeah. Well, but having the ability to learn and improve is absolutely vital, because we're just not going to get it right the very first time, or maybe the second time, or the third time, right? But if we can be doing better every single year, that's really the important thing.
Yes.
Yeah, because the other thing that we can't do is wait 50 years until everything's perfect. Yeah, because for one, it'll never be perfect. And 50 years from now, like, I don't know, like all these guys are saying Florida is going to be underwater. So I guess like we better, get to work, right?
Yeah, totally.
We don't
progress.
have the time to wait.
Yeah, we need progress, not perfection, right? I think that's
exactly.
That's one of our biggest holdups in society in a lot of ways, right? Is we're looking for that perfect answer. And it's like, well, it's not going to come, because it's always changing, and our understanding is always changing, and we're never going to be perfect. Let's just work on progress, one step at a time. Let's move this in the right direction. Yeah. That's one. And understand the trade-offs, right? Like, as soon as you say, well, perfection isn't possible, then it just becomes a conversation around like, well, what are the trade-offs that we're making, and can we be thoughtful and deliberate about those? And that's one of the most fulfilling parts to me of my work at NCX, right? Is talking to landowners and being like, listen, like, it depends on your preferences, and like, there's no perfect option here. It's just like, you got to weigh these trade-offs. And that's like all natural resource management is a question of trade-offs. Like, you want more carbon in the forest? Well, maybe your fire risk is going up, and there's no free lunch here, but it is possible to make deliberate decisions about these trade-offs. And informed decisions. Yeah, totally. And that's the thing. I think company like yours that's providing that information and giving direction to people, and kind of just making it plain, right? Making it tangible, making it approachable. That's a huge benefit to landowners, to be able to make the right decisions for their land right now, right? So that's huge, because waiting till, like you said, waiting till we get it all sorted out. We don't have that time. If we're trying to curb climate change, we're trying to do all that, like, we got to make these small steps now and ramp them up as we figure it out, for sure.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, totally. So in your mind, I'm assuming that the biggest barrier that you guys seen to getting landowners into these programs is probably the confusion. I'm assuming, like, it's just the not the disinformation, that's the wrong word, but just the confusion of all these programs and how do I create it? Is that the biggest thing that's stopping people?
It used to be. I mean, so my whole mission in life now, right? Like, I wake up every day and I try to figure out, like, how do we help landowners go from, finding their property on a map and even seeing like what all their options are, to like finding an option that's a good fit, and then like ultimately going under contract with one of these. And so we've actually gotten pretty good about helping landowners figure out which options are attractive to them, at least, and some of that's just the data work of understanding like the payoffs of these things and the restrictions. Honestly, the biggest thing that we changed in the last couple months is we started offering like just free one-on-one consultations with landowners. And it turns out like that's the thing that actually gets people moving on this, right? Because a lot of landowners just want to talk to a real human and figure out what's actually going on. But even after that step, even after the landowner said like, okay, well, I think this program might make sense for me, when it comes time to go to contracting and the landowner's looking at a contract and they're looking at the actual dollars and cents, it's becoming pretty serious. A lot of the time landowners come to the conclusion, they're like, well, I don't know if I feel like I have to make this decision right now. And like, this isn't like maybe a super compelling risk reward profile for me. It's like maybe kind of on the bubble, and like, maybe I should just wait.
Yeah.
And like a lot of times that's a totally reasonable decision for landowners to make, and our job isn't to push landowners to sign any particular contract or anything.
Yeah.
Right. Like we just want to help landowners understand what their options are. And when a program shows up that's the right fit for them, like then that's great.
Yeah.
But it's still pretty early days. And so like not every program is going to work for every landowner. And so that, like ultimately like the economic dollars and cents on a lot of these programs, it's not obvious hell yes all the time for landowners right now. But a lot of our work is geared around like, well, can we stack a couple different programs together that actually make this pencil out? Or, or maybe it's wait and see.
Yeah.
And it just depends for every individual landowner.
Yeah. That's hard to hear. It's too bad that there's not more. It sounds like there's a lot of attempts to try to promote, nature positive solutions to stuff. And some of them are working out and some of them are fizzing out and some of them are in the middle, kind of wavering. It's unfortunate there's not some aggressive push from somewhere to do this, right? And it's because it seems like there's so much potential especially in a place like the United States where there's so much private land, right?
Yep.
There's just so much out there. There's so much opportunity for creating nature positive solutions and sustainable environments, right? And carbon capture opportunities and all that kind of stuff. And it would just be such a shame for, like, when we're talking about, the sooner as a globe, the sooner we can get people to do this, the better for the society. But yeah, like to put that on one individual landowner and be like, it's your responsibility to do this. Like that sucks. Like that's when they're taking all the risk.
Yeah. I mean, it's still early. I mean, that's the other thing is like, I'm not surprised actually that's, the general shape of the landscape. Right. And it's different for individual landowners too, right? Yeah. Like you may be in a geography where actually there's a couple programs that really are compelling and make a lot of sense. Right. But that aren't available in other parts of the country. And it's changing all the time. And that's what we help landowners kind of wrap their heads around. It's like, well, what's the flavor of program I want? What's the risk reward profile that actually is going to make sense for me? And like, is that available? Like, if yes, great. If not, like, let me know when that shows up, and it's happening all the time. There's new project developers, new types of projects coming up every week.
That's great. Good to hear. That's good to hear. Yeah, you were saying earlier, you said in 5 years, there might be hundreds of these options. So that's...
Yeah, well, I mean, we should hope so. I mean, it's just like the reality is like when you start working on land, like it's complicated, right? It's going to take a big effort. It's not going to be a one size fits all solution. I think there's going to be different things that make sense in different regions for different types of landowners, for different values. And so there need to be a lot of different project developers to just implement these things across the landscape. So...
Yeah. No, yeah, totally. We have a lot of values, right? And we need at least one program for each one.
Yeah, exactly. And ideally multiple programs, right? Like landowners shouldn't want there to be just one option. Like the more options there are for landowners, the better. But also the more options there are, the more confusing it is. And so that's part of the problem we're trying to solve.
Yeah. No, you definitely want competition to promote it getting better and better, right? That makes sense.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I suppose it's funny. I'm only realizing now as we're talking that a lot of these failed carbon capture programs where some Bloomberg article comes out, like you said, and starts pointing fingers at where people made mistakes. I think that seems like that's where the idea of greenwashing came from, right? That concept of we've got this eco positive solution here, and people were like, at some point they figured out that it's not actually doing what they said, but who knows if that company actually knew, and they just say it's greenwashing and it's corporate greed, and like, those people are bad. The big bad corporation is always where people point their finger, right? And that concept of greenwashing is, I feel like it's such an easy one to be like, well, the corporations are bad, so they must be greenwashing, and you can't trust their incentives, right? And it sucks because they're the ones with the money. They're the ones who can afford to invest, and to just label it like that is just, it just ruins the opportunity, and it just puts us further in the hole that we're trying to climb out of, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll say that it's rare that I meet somebody that I'm like, this person is evil in this industry.
For sure.
It's just like it's not what people get into this for. And a lot of the people on the sustainability teams at these corporations, these guys have been hired in the last couple of years, right? As these companies have made these commitments, they tend, it attracts a lot of true believers, I'd say, in the field. And so it's people that I think often are working with the best of intentions, but they're also just human, and they often do not have PhDs in like forest carbon additionality stuff. And so really a lot of these corporate buyers are failed by the rulemaking bodies in this space, the certification bodies. It's like, well, actually, one of the things that we've learned in the last couple of years is that a certified forest carbon credit actually doesn't provide maybe the protection that you thought it did. Like maybe you can't actually trust it just because it's certified. And that's a real challenge because these, if you're on the sustainability team at a company, it's like, yeah, certainly part of your job is trying to buy good forest carbon credits. But then you have a whole other part of your job, which is like, well, how much carbon are we putting into the atmosphere and all the supply chain, like emissions accounting and all. And that's like a whole other field that they got to go get a PhD in.
Yeah.
Right. And so it is complicated. And there are companies that are coming up now to try to simplify this and make it a little easier for everybody in this space. Cause it is really important, but it's also complicated and confusing because the planet and nature are complicated and confusing. So, but if we don't make it simpler for landowners, then we're just not going to solve the problem.
No, for sure. Absolutely. Yeah. No, I want to see more of this. And so what I want to know, I want to know what your pipe dream is, right? Like what in your perfect world, if you could control, what these incentives are, how do you see that balance between, providing revenue streams for landowners to incentivize something like I would love to see it at the point where we could be like, okay, I want to incentivize biodiversity, right? I want to see more habitat and I want to see more biodiversity. I want to see better water quality. I want to see those things that you can't really get paid for unless someone, some billionaire is like, I want to pay you to do this, right? I want to see more of that because those are the things that we're getting to now, right? Like we want carbon capture, but we also want we want rich forest communities, right? We want them to not just be carbon capture, plantations. We want them to provide all kinds of different additional values to the landscape and to us. And so I would love to see that. So I want to know what your pipe dream is and where you see this going or where you hope it's going.
Yeah. Well, so this, in an ideal world, like let's just start from the landowner perspective, because I think that one actually is a pretty straightforward one to understand. It would be amazing if landowners had a lot of different good options for how to manage and get paid for managing their land, right? Like the more revenue streams, the more diversified you can be, the better. I was talking to a guy the other day that was like, it used to be that farmers used to grow like 1,000 acres of soybeans and that was it, right? Like you had a bunch of different baskets of things. You would have some poultry, you would have, some row crops, you'd maybe graze a couple cattle, and you had like a diversified bunch of baskets.
Totally.
And the more baskets you can have, the more diversified you are, the better deal that you're getting in each of those baskets, the better your economics are, and the more resilient you are as an individual producer in this economy. But it's complicated. It's complicated to be diversified, right? I mean, that's why there's like mutual funds and stuff in the stock market, right?
Yeah.
But the more options landowners have, the better, right? Like if you're a landowner in just like timber, right? Like if there's only one mill, then we all know how that game goes, right? Like that doesn't end well for the landowner, right? Like you want more options. Yeah. And so the more options landowners have, the better their economic outcomes are going to be, and the better ecological outcomes we're going to have for the planet. Now, on the other side of the market, this question of who pays, where does the willingness to pay come from? That like starts to get into a little bit more political things, right? Like, because if you say like, maybe I think it should be the government that pays for these things, it's like, well, that's actually, that's you and me paying for these things like through our taxes, right? Or, if I think it's the corporations that should pay, like, well, actually that's you and me paying again, but like in just higher prices for other things, right? Or it's like,
it's always you and me.
Maybe we should be paying, but the question of like, where does that willingness to pay come from? That still is being worked out. I think for carbon, at least in the US, we're starting to coalesce around this idea that like, well, companies should probably be responsible for their carbon emissions. Now, like there's a whole, rat's nest of complication about like scope 2 versus scope 3 that we do not need to get into on this podcast right now, and double counting for all that stuff. But for these other values, things like wildfire risk, very controversial about who should be holding the bag on that. Sure. Should it be PG&E in California? Should it be the homeowners through their insurance? Should it be the insurance company? Should it be the state? Like that's playing out in real time right now. And it's not clear what the answer is going to be. I'm sure it's going to be an answer that nobody's happy with. That's the only thing that I'm sure of. So
well, that's how you know it was a good deal.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Do you have, I'm assuming you do, but I'm assuming you have a positive outlook for the future, and that you see, as complicated as things are and as much as is going on, I assume that you do believe that things are going to get better and at least more tangible as time goes on.
Yeah, I think we are seeing the growing pains of the early stage of this new industry, like which everybody knows is important. It'd be insane to me if in 2100 we were not measuring and paying for value in nature, right?
Totally.
Like we care about that as a civilization. We don't have enough of it. We want more of it. Like there's a pretty straightforward capitalist playbook for how you do that. Is like you pay for it.
Yeah.
Now the question of like who pays for that? How are we measuring the stuff exactly?
Yeah.
That still all needs to get worked out. And what's the time frame on that? Like I couldn't sit here and tell you that like, oh, it's going to be next year or even that it's going to be by 2030. But a lot of what we do at NCX is we're laying the foundation so that like when that time comes, we're ready to go. Landowners have good tools and a good framework to use for how to think about these trade-offs between like, should I just keep on growing timber on a 40-year rotation over here, or should I think about doing something else? And so there is still a lot of education work to do in the meantime, and a lot of stuff to build. And as these new programs come up, we'll see what's working for landowners in certain regions. Those successful models are gonna go to other places.
Yeah,
there will probably be stuff that we learn from countries outside the U.S. I heard the Canadians got some good ideas, going on up there. So
we'll see.
Who knows? Yeah. So it's still early though.
For sure.
And that's okay. I mean, it is going to take some time to work these things out. But for us, our core thing has always been being as straight with the landowners as possible, making sure that they have clear data and can make informed decisions about these things. Because ultimately, the other thing that I know for sure is that any climate economy ultimately goes through the landowners, the people that are the stewards and the managers of the land. It has to. And so that's always been our position here at NCX. And it's just, it is a really exciting time though, because stuff is changing every week. And it feels like on the scale of the next 100 years, like this decade that we're in is going to actually be pretty important for laying the groundwork for how this part of the economy works.
Totally. Yeah. No, it feels a bit inevitable, right? These values are only getting more and more important in people's minds. They're coming top of the list. People want to be part of that. The individual consumer wants to be a part of that, sustainable economy, circular economy kind of thing, right? So, there's only more incentive. It seems it would be odd if it wasn't getting more tangible as time goes on, for sure.
Yep. So still plenty of things to figure out though.
Oh my God. Yeah, of course. I got a taste of that today and I'm very overwhelmed. But, finally, I just want to leave people with some kind of actionable piece of material. You know what I mean? So whether you're a landowner, how can you contribute to these kind of ideas, or maybe you're a consumer or just an everyday person, how can you support the ideas of nature positive economies and changing the way our marketplace works to actually support people doing the right thing as far as sustainability is concerned?
Yeah. The simplest thing from an NCX perspective right now is you go on our website and it's totally free and you just put in your address and we show you what your options are. Right. And
nice.
Like ultimately it comes down to landowners and what individual landowners' economics are going to be. But when you understand what the options are for your land, like maybe there is something that makes sense. Like maybe you actually can start getting paid today for some of these non-traditional forest or nature values on your property. And it doesn't, you don't have to start off doing the whole property either, right? Like you can start with like a small part of your property or like do some program that isn't like 100-year commitment, right? Like start off, we see a lot of landowners actually start off with recreational leasing because it's an easy thing to
totally
turn on and off. You can do it for a year and if you like it, you do it again. And if not, then you don't. But just to understand what the options are and take some small steps, right? Like we were talking about, there is a lot of uncertainty in the market. And so like in that kind of context, what you can do is you can, keep your head on a swivel, take a small step in what you think is the right direction, learn, and then make a better decision next year. Right. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to help landowners do.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So, and then, finally, I should have asked you this earlier on. It's weird to put it right at the end, but in the interest of transparency, how does NCX charge for these services? Yeah.
So we get like a commission fee from the private project developers. that are on the site. There's a bunch of government programs on the site right now where we don't make any money. Like we're trying to, get some government grants to support some of that work right there. Because a lot of the government programs from a risk reward standpoint for a lot of landowners actually like are on a pretty good part of that spectrum.
Okay.
But like it's a little, it's much more sustainable for us as a business if we can actually get some revenue to like pay for that. But like the government's offering these programs and actually the government does have a lot of funding available for landowner outreach and education style stuff. And so we do some of that, but most of our revenue comes from these project developers. But like the nice thing about where we sit as a company is I don't sit here and try to like shill for any individual program, right? Like my job is to show the landowners the options that they have available for their land. And then if something does make sense for them, and like we've helped them sort of through that process, then we do get a commission payment from the project developer, but it allows us to be pretty, just be straight with the landowner and say like, this is our framework for how you should think about these things. This is how these different programs score on these criteria. And then like ultimately the choice is the landowners, right? Like we try to just give them as much information as possible and then they do what's right for them and their land.
Gotcha. You're nature's mortgage broker,
Yeah, it almost feels, it's like a wealth advisor almost, but for like the natural capital asset class rather than your stock portfolio.
There you go.
And I would say like the industry overall is not nearly at that level of maturity of like those guys, but but it's evolving pretty quickly and it's just for me personally it's a fascinating part of the economy to work in, and it matters, right? Like these are real landowners, these are real acres, and it really matters for the climate and for nature and for all these values that we care about on the landscape. And so it's that's my favorite part of all this.
Yeah. No, it's always it definitely helps when you go home feeling good about what you did that day, right? Like how you contributed, how have you been a part of the solution? Yeah, it makes a big difference. Well, yeah, this is an awesome conversation. Thanks a lot, Max, for taking the time and for being so transparent and honest, open with how everything works and your perspective on what's going on. Because I think it helps people feel a little bit at ease and helps clarify it for me too about like what exactly is going on. Yep. And I know that right now you guys you're only in the States, right? You're not operating in Canada yet. So, but there's a big chunk of my listeners that are from the States. So hopefully that's helpful and that pushes it in that direction. And I hope that from the sounds of it, I hope you guys can figure out how to get into Canada at some point too. That'd be fantastic because there's definitely some places
it's on the list. We got some more work to do here in the States first, but ultimately, like we'd love to be working with landowners all over the world. But one small step at a time here first.
One step at a time. Yeah, make sure you can chew the bite that you take. Yeah,
exactly. Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for listening. I know that was a little bit outside of the norm for this podcast. We don't usually dive into the economy of stuff so much, and this is a little different, but I think it's crucial. This is the age that we live in, right? So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that. Shoot me an email, yourforestpodcast@gmail.com. You can obviously reach out to Max or to NCX if you're interested. And love to hear your feedback. We'll catch y'all next time. Take it easy.